Bob asked me to do this one. I looked at the topic and I thought, I really don't know if I'm qualified to talk about authority, because everyone I'm going to be speaking to is at least a year older than me, maybe a couple. So, it's going to be a little odd talking about authority in a Bible class setting. When we think about authority, what is the first thing that comes up in our minds? When we think about, any of us, when we think about authority, what's one of the first things that pops to mind? Yeah, I'm in charge. What did you say, Don? Government, law enforcement. So, coming to the church level, elders. So you start looking at, you see our minds fire in different ways as individuals. But when we think about it collectively, we start looking at all the aspects of life. The governmental look at it, law enforcement look at it. Then we come back to the church government, and that's actually how we need to look at this. Is there's a governmental structure in the church, and we'll get to that. But that's not where I want to start at. I want us to think about this. Not only are the things that we just said, but think about even down into the home. Think about this. Parents are an authority figure for their children. Ashley and I found out we were pregnant with Annabelle. I was scared to death, and I still am. I'll admit it. I'm scared every day I wake up. Am I going to do this right? It's a challenge, and I know the majority of everyone in this room has children. And you know exactly where I'm coming from. It's a challenge every day. We're humans. We're not going to get it right 100%. All we can do is give it our best shot. And that's all anybody can do with any position in this life. Whether we're a parent, whether we are an older sibling put in charge of our younger siblings, whether we're a boss that's taking charge at work, if we're in a governmental position, whether it's from a local city councilman all the way up to the President of the United States. When we think about authority, I want us to think about this as we work our way through this class. What is the most influential and the most powerful position that can be held by man in this life? Say it again. An elder. Elder in the Lord's church. Men can rise to the occasion to be city councilmen, county commissioners, state legislators, serve in Congress, even serve as President of the United States or as a king of a nation. But the men who will rise to the occasion and fill the shoes of serving as an elder in the Lord's church take on the greatest responsibility that can be taken on by anyone in this life. And the reason I bring it up right now is as we work through this, I want you to be thinking about this. We give a lot of respect. There's a lot of respect given to authorities, to the secular authorities. But there's so many times people want to ignore what the elders have to say in a local congregation. And as we work our way through through this study this evening, and I'm not sure if I can get through it in the next 90 seconds, but we'll try, because that's what the clock back here on the wall tells me, is I have 90 seconds left. But we'll see where we get by the end of this lesson, see where we can end up with this, and see if we can find wisdom regarding those in authority in the scriptures. I want us to start with this. Think about in Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 10. And I invite you to turn there. And I'm not going to jump as quick as I do typically through a sermon. We'll take our time, look at these verses. I want us to look at them to see what Solomon has to say about it, and also go to not only here in Proverbs, but to think about other passages that will complement and go along with this in the Old Testament as well as in the New. In Proverbs chapter 16, verse 10, he says, Divination is on the lips of the king. His mouth must not transgress in judgment. And he continues on in verse 11. He says, honest weights and scales are the Lord's. All the weights and bag are his work. Think about what he says in verse 10. Divination is on the lips of the king. His mouth must not transgress in judgment. What's he saying here? He's saying the one who is serving as a king, the one who's serving in authority, has to what? When he is exercising judgment, what does he have to do? He has to be just. He has to be just in what he does. He just can't go in there and hear one side of the story and say, okay, that's it. I'm willing to count the other party guilty. He has to what? He has to hear both sides. He has to hear both sides of the story in their completeness, not just in what each party wants him to hear. And if he's not getting a complete story from both parties, he has to be extremely cautious when he exercises and processes and hands judgment down for whatever the call is going to be. The decisions that are made under a judge, under a king, under anyone in authority. Bob's a prosecuting attorney. You came before a judge. You presented the case to him, but the judge a lot of times had a huge burden on his shoulders if there was no jury present. I think about this when I look at passages like this here, when it says that out of a judge's or a king's mouth must not transgress, and he must not transgress in his judgment. I think about this. What about those who serve in a jury trial as we know it in our country? You ever thought about that? You serve on a jury. You're hearing a case. You're not the judge, but you're handing down a verdict that a judge is going to take and say, here's how this person's going to pay their debt to society for what they did. It takes a lot of wisdom to look at this. People say, I'd love to serve on a jury trial. Not me. Because you're never going to get a full picture from both sides. Regardless of how hard they try. There's always going to be missing facts. There's always going to be something missing that after the fact they're going to say, oh, wait a minute. This was missing, and they're going to appeal it. And they come back and they say, well, this was missed or that was missed. So much goes into it. And it lays back. And I think about cases where it's the death penalty involved. That the one who's found guilty is sentenced to death. The weight that lays on those members of that jury that found that individual guilty and recommends a death penalty. And then the judge who has to have the wisdom to say, you know what? This is either worthy of the death penalty or it's not. That goes back to it. And turn over to Proverbs chapter 20. Turn over a page in your Bibles. Proverbs 20. We're going to look at two verses here. In verse 8, in Proverbs 20, Solomon says, a king who sits on the throne of judgment scatters all evil with his eyes. And then we drop down to verse 26. And he says, a wise king sifts out the wicked and brings the threshing wheel over them. Think about what he says here. He scatters all evil with his eyes. He pulls out the details of this and then drop down to verse 26. And he says, he sifts out the wicked and brings the threshing wheel over them. Think about a threshing floor. You bring a harvest in and you're bringing all this wheat and everything in. This big stone wheel is coming over everything and it's processing it. It's taking the outer casings of the plant off. It's bringing it down to what they want and what they don't want. Essentially, it's destroying the outer parts. King has to exercise extreme wisdom when he does this. He sifts out the wicked. If somebody's guilty, he knows it. He'll find it out. And he'll exercise punishment accordingly. Now, turn over to Romans chapter 13, if you will, and hold your place in Proverbs, because we're going to be coming back and forth between Romans 13 and book of Proverbs. But in Romans chapter 13, in verse 1, Paul records there, he says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God." I want us to think about this. These individuals, even today, back in Old Testament times, God would divinely appoint them to their position. Are authorities now placed by God into their positions? Don't be afraid to speak up.
Generically, yes.
Okay. Generically, yes. Dawn?
I would say God established that there be order and that there be authority. He did not set individuals in those seats of authority.
Exactly. We look at in our culture today, what Dawn just said was, God doesn't place the individual. He established the system of government. So providentially, he has established. He established this. So providentially, by God's hand, these people do come to be an authority. A lot of people will say, well, God still providentially places leaders in there because he established the system of government we know. God's the origin of everything that is in existence, came from him. Everything we know that is good and honorable. Government is good and honorable if it's run the way that it's supposed to be run. We know that. So when we think about this, what Paul's saying here, there's no authority except from God, and they're appointed by God. Again, they're not divinely put in there. How's another way that let me ask this: when we think about those in authority, I want us to think about this. How can they be, when we say they're providentially placed, what's one of the ways they can be providentially placed in a position of authority? Think 2 weeks from now, 2 or 3 weeks. Elections. Yeah, God said you can have. Yeah, back in that time, yeah, King Saul was God's anointed, is how David refers to him. But yeah, in our culture today, God providentially places leaders into place. We have a huge impact. We have a huge impact in this, and I've heard Bob speak on this, and since I've been here, that God will providentially place leaders in place. How? By us going to the polls and casting our vote. If people who claim to be God-fearing people don't go and help to elect officials into office to lead our nation, that are going to lead it in a direction that we need to be going in a way, we've complied with them and said, okay, we're going to allow this person who is evil to lead. God's providence. We have a choice. We live in a country that is unique. Not like what Joey brought up. When Israel wanted a king and they insisted on having a king. And Saul was brought into the picture. That was God, directly having influence on that. Today, he doesn't divinely reach down and say, I'm going to put person A, B, and C in these places. But by us having the opportunity we have in this country with the voting process, we're able to put those individuals into place and help to put people in to places where they need to be. And sometimes there's people that they're put in office that shouldn't be there. And we're going to get to how we are to be treating them here in a moment. Jim, you have your hand up?
I was going to say that in the same way that elections can pick somebody that leads the whole country and the church in the opposite direction that God would want us to go, we have all kinds of historical information in the Bible that tells us that, yes, Saul was appointed by God, David was appointed by God, Solomon was appointed by God, but then it began to be people just basically following whoever they wanted to follow as king. And that led them down the path of being overcome, Israel overcome by Assyria, Judah being overcome by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. But remember that God also used those nations to punish people. And in fact, Nebuchadnezzar brought them out into 70 years of Babylonian captivity. But way before the time, God had already chosen specifically Cyrus to bring them back.
Exactly. So hang on to that thought. We're going to get, and I'm glad you brought that up, but that's going to be here in a couple of minutes. So I'm glad you brought that up. Keep that in mind, what he's talking about, how people did not, the people's disregard of authority, if you will. And we'll get to that here in a moment. And I'm glad you did bring that up. But think about this. We're talking about the duties that authorities have. I want us to think about this. Authorities have duties, but what should be the characteristics? A couple of them we've already hit. They have to be slow to judgment. What else? But what are some of the characteristics that somebody in authority needs to have? Humility. What else? Honesty. Integrity. So think about. Go ahead, Chris. Wisdom. They have to be. Yes, that's a huge thing. So turn back over to Proverbs 16, and it's a verse we've already read. In Proverbs 16, verse 10. Again, we're going back to this, but we're going to go to verse 12. But they have to hold all those attributes that were just mentioned. In verse 10, again, it says, divination is on the lips of the king. His mouth must not transgress in judgment. Drop down to verse 12. Solomon writes, it is an abomination for kings to commit wickedness, for a throne is established by righteousness. Going back to what Don said a few minutes ago, God established the system of government. God's the one who has put everything into motion. Man is the one who brings corruption and brings sin and brings evil into any system we see. You go all the way back, and this is what I tell told the teenage class since I've been here when I'm teaching them. Think about this. Anytime we're looking at anything, we can trace everything back to the Garden of Eden. Everything was perfect in the Garden of Eden. And I don't lay it at Eve's feet alone for the fall of man. Adam was right there with her, and he should have stopped her. Man brought sin into the world. Satan tempted them. They fell for the temptation. They brought sin into the world. The wisdom was gone. Perfection was gone. I can't even imagine what it was like for Adam and Eve to be living in complete perfection and complete harmony with God and able to walk and talk with the Spirit of the Lord in the Garden of Eden, and then they had to go and mess it up. And now here we are, struggling still. with every system that's ever been put into place, somehow we as mankind have brought corruption and sin and wickedness into it. And when we look at verse 12, we think about this. It's an abomination for kings to commit wickedness, but the throne is established of righteousness. It's an abomination for a king to abuse his authority. But how many times through history do we see kings abuse authority? And it's not only in the Bible. Study secular history. We can study history as recently as 80 years ago and see world leaders who just went completely off the deep end, murdered millions and millions and millions of people. People said that they got by with that. Did they get by with it? No. It sends chills up and down my spine to think that Adolf Hitler was a soul, was precious in the eyes of God. He committed atrocities that were none of us can begin to comprehend. But if he would have repented of his sins, God would have forgiven him, and he had hope of eternal life if he had made himself right with God. Yet he left this life separated from God. Think about this more recently. What was it, Bob, 40 years ago, Jeffrey Dahmer, or was it 35 years ago? Jeffrey Dahmer, serial killer. His name's back in the spotlight. Brother Garland Elkins actually had set up Bible studies with this man. He was a serial killer. Set up Bible studies with him. They said that Brother Elkins was able to stay with him. Jeffrey Dahmer obeyed the gospel before he was murdered in prison. He was still paying his debt to society, but yeah, good. But yeah, he obeyed the gospel while he was in prison. He's still paying his debt to society, then he's murdered. Thank God they were able to get the material in him. He studied his way out of his sinful ways, learned that he was lost, made himself right. Someone who committed this atrocity. Now, he was rightfully serving a sentence in prison for crimes that he had done. Judgment had been exercised against him. Now, let me ask you this. That was rightfully done. What would happen if they came in here right now, came barging through these doors, and they came up here and arrested Bob and I both, and they threw these bogus charges out that we had committed all these crimes. They took us and locked us up and said, "You're never getting out of prison again." And they potentially sentenced us to death just for what somebody said. That's an abomination in the eyes of God for the rulers and for those who are in charge in this country, or whatever country we live in, to do that. It's unwise. And that's what we need to remember. So when we look at these things, to admit they're making judgments, they're exercising judgment against people, they have to be wise, they have to be calm, they have to be reasonable, they have to be able to administer justice righteously and fairly. They have to be free of evil influence. They have to keep themselves away from bribery. They have to keep them, and I'm talking in any fashion. They have to make sure that they're not being lobbied to do that which is in favor of a particular group. They have to really watch themselves. The people who run for political office need to remember these things. It's just not fun and games. It's not like a little kids club out in the neighborhood where you can kick somebody out and bring another person in, and it's all fun and games. Those who are in secular authority are still amenable to the law of God. They're going to be amenable to Him, and they have judgment for what they do. A lot of people forget this. A lot of people say, "Well, let's just go back to the elders," and the elders are the ones that are held accountable. That's not what I read in the Scriptures. I read that anybody who has any type of authority is going to be amenable in the day of judgment before the throne of God for the actions that they've taken. Now think about this. We're describing these things and their qualities. Now, you think about the duties and the qualities that are given here. Turn over to 1 Timothy chapter 3. I want us to think about this. We're talking about these things. We're talking about secular government. But then we come back here and we talk about we come back to the elders in the Lord's church. 1 Timothy chapter 3. You look at the first 7 verses in this chapter. It's a lengthy list of things. Why does Paul give such a lengthy list for leaders in the Lord's church and not in secular government?
Church is more important.
Okay, church is more important. It is. Don, you got a comment?
Well, if we compare church government to secular government, we see in secular government that whether a man is righteous or unrighteous, he has the authority. And he had, even thinking about Roman times, they were ruled by an emperor who was unjust, who was ungodly, who was a terrible person. Their local ruler, whether it was Pilate or the one who succeeded him, they were terrible people. And yet they had the authority, and the people who lived there had to respect that authority, whether the ruler was righteous or unrighteous. That should not be the authority that is exercised in the church. Their righteousness matters. Of course, it matters in the civil authority too, but that doesn't prevent the person from being there. In the church, the person who is unrighteous should not be there in that seat of authority.
Exactly. And to try to put it in simple terms, what he just said was, and I don't know if you all could hear him, but Don was saying that in the church, anyone who's unrighteous should not be in a system of authority. You look back even to Roman times, you had those who were ungodly, who were tyrants. They would do what they wanted, and people had no choice but to serve under them. They had to do, they were their beck and call, essentially. And whatever they said, they had to do. You can't have somebody like that in the church. But going back to what I think what you started with, Don, was there should be similarities. I want us to read, and I want us to hear what Paul says here in 1 Timothy chapter 3. First 7 verses, Paul says, "This is a faithful saying. If a man desires the position of a bishop, that is, of an elder, he desires a good work. A bishop or an elder then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, apt to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. Or if a man does not know how to rule his own home, how will he take care of the church of God? He's not a novice, lest he's puffed up with pride, and he falls in the same condemnation as the devil. Moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil." Now, I want us to think about this. This is a list of attributes given for men who serve as leaders of the Lord's church. It's very specific, it's very pointed, it's very sharp. It divides the boys from the men, the good from the bad, the wise from the unwise, however you want to put it. It's very pointed. The men who serve as the elders here at Central take these qualifications very seriously. They look at it. They look at this list. It's very and whether it's the men who serve as the elders here at Central or whatever congregation you're in, those men have a huge weight on their shoulders. Huge weight, and it just doesn't weigh on their shoulders. It weighs on their wives' shoulders. It weighs very heavy as a married couple. It's a very heavy burden for that couple for that man to undertake this. But think about about the attributes that are given here. What is unique about that? Can we take these attributes and take them outside of the church and apply them to secular government? Wouldn't work. Yeah, it wouldn't work, but. But and you're very right. There are very few who meet that. But here's the thing we need to be thinking about. You can't hold an elected official out here in the city to having to necessarily be married or necessarily having children, but these other attributes that we read about, that he's not a novice, he's not puffed up, and he's an older, a man who has wisdom. He has a good reputation in the community. If we would be, that's what we need to remember. Where does this wisdom come from? It doesn't just all of a sudden, just boom, one day, just come to me in an epiphany of, oh my goodness, I have all this wisdom in the world. It's learned. It's learned. It's acquired over the course of an entire lifespan, however long that is. And here's what we need to be remembering. Whether it's elders in the Lord's church, whether it's elected officials out here, or whether it's those of us who are parents, what are we exhibiting to the younger generations that are going to be stepping up and taking over in the next 20 to 30 years? That's what and think about that. Are we setting an example to help these younger generations to serve in wisdom? To have respect for authority? Because you look at this, take a look around the country. We have people who are serving in elected positions or appointed positions who are completely out of control. They have disregard for their own authority. They have disregard for the position they hold. They don't have the wisdom that it takes to be in where they're at and to be doing the things they're doing. And they don't think twice about it. So the duties for those who are in authority, their duties, they have to be wise, they have to be just, they have to be fair, they have to make sure they're looking at they're well-rounded. Their qualities, they need to be of a good reputation. They need to be people who are upstanding in the community. They should be, at least. They need to be somebody who can be trusted, somebody who has some experience behind them to be able to lead in whatever capacity that they're in. Now think about this. Now we fall into the portion of those who are under them. Now we come down to what is our duty? What is our duty to the elected officials? Our duty is to what? To what? To obey them. As long as what? Which as long as it doesn't violate God's will. Turn over to Proverbs chapter 24. In Proverbs 24, we see an example here to honor those who are in authority. We're supposed to honor those who are in authority. We're supposed to respect them. And we're supposed to not be, to act with, what's the word? I can't think of I can't get the words on the tip of my, it's right there on the tip of my tongue, I can't get it out. They can't have malice in our heart toward it. We have to really be careful. So there's a lot of people in the country. Somebody say something? I thought I heard somebody back in the back of the room say something. We have to remember this. There may be those who actually are holding an office we may not like. We may despise the person and what they're doing. But does that give us the right to disrespect that person just because we don't like them? No. I may not like the person that's in the Senate seat right now from my district. I might not like who's sitting in the governor's office in my state. I may not like the person who is occupying the Oval Office for the President of the United States. But that does not give me the right to disrespect them. I have to respect that office. I may not like the personality, the person and the personality that's in there, but that doesn't allow me, that does not afford me the opportunity to disrespect and to slander that person. We have to give honor where honor is due. Proverbs 24, verses 21 and 22. Solomon says here, my son, fear the Lord and the king. Do not associate with those things given to change, for their calamity will rise suddenly, and who knows the ruin those two can bring. So think about this. We're to respect those who are in authority. We have to respect them. We can't just be with every little whim. Think about this, and then going back to what Julia said a while ago about King Saul. What happened in the last half of the book of 1 Samuel? What takes place between David and King Saul? There's a lot, but there are 3 times that I can think of. There are 3 things. There are 3 occasions that come to my mind, or off the top of my head. 3 times that something could have happened. Saul was trying to kill David, but what happened?
David had 3 occasions when he had the advantage and could have killed Saul.
Exactly. David had 3 occasions when he could have killed King Saul. What did he say, though? He would not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. Then when Saul's in battle, Saul is killed and his sons. And then this messenger comes to David and is bragging about how he had helped to make sure that when King Saul had asked him to help him to go ahead and end his life, what did David do to the individual who had done that? He executed him. Why? He said, how could you do that to God's anointed? Even though Saul was wicked, even though David had 3 specific instances recorded that he could have killed this king. One comes to mind in particular when where David and his men are hiding in this cave. King Saul comes into the cave, puts his sword down to take care of some personal business, if you will, bodily function. David's men wanted him to kill him on the spot because he was defenseless. Instead, what did David do? Cut the tail end off his robe. Then he goes out once Saul's back out on the battlefield and says, hey, you know what? I could have killed you. I could have taken your life while you're sitting in that cave. David was in a position of authority. He was leading men. He could have set an example. I can take a life of a king whenever and however I want, and when the opportunity arises. He didn't agree with Saul. Saul was out to kill him. David knew it. But he respected authority. He respected the king. He was matter of fact, he was his father-in-law. Saul was. Sonia. That's exactly right. I appreciate you bringing that up, because and you're right, and that's what I was trying to get at a while ago. And I'm glad you brought that up, because we have to be setting the example for our younger generations, like you just said. They think that because there's this written document that says you have freedom of speech, that you can just blurt out anything you want, whenever you want, however you want, and there's no consequences to go with it. Let me ask this. Think about this, and we're talking about having respect for those in authority. What happens to someone who utters a threat against the President of the United States? The only thing they have to do is just say the words. What happens to them? They're arrested and they're prosecuted. Why? It's against the law, but it's a threat against the leader of what people call the free world. There is respect that's in the law. But going back to what Sonia just said, there's a generation that's coming up that says, wait a minute, I can say whatever I want, however I want. You can't. And I appreciate what you said, Sonia, with the aspect of we have to be teaching our younger generations. Just because you don't agree with those in authority and you don't agree with the people who occupy the offices, you still respect the office, but you need to be praying for them. We are held to a much higher authority. We can't be going out here and using the telephone. I'm going to start 100 years ago, when or more. It'd be over 100 years ago now, wouldn't it, Bob? When telephone came, you remember when it came into existence. But think about this. When the telephone came into existence, it was a good thing to be able to reach out and touch someone and be able to talk long distance instantaneously. But you think about this. That was the downward spiral of our culture and our society. Why? Because Betty Gossip was able to get on the phone and begin gossiping about things. Telephone came along. Then radio came along. And television came along. Then the internet came along. And we have computers. We have smartphones. You have a computer that fits in your pocket now. You can go on there. You can send an email, a text message. You can get on there. You can make it so a message is seen by the entire globe within seconds and blast someone out of the water and slander them. But as Christians, we're held to a higher standard. Where's that higher standard found at? Turn over to Titus chapter 2. Titus chapter 2. This one hits hits home. And I use this among other passages for myself. Believe me. To stand here and say, oh, I don't have any issues in my life I need to resolve. I don't get angry at times and I don't want to say this and that. I'd be a liar and in danger of losing my own soul. I have to remind myself of passages like this here in Titus chapter 2. Listen to what Paul writes in the first 10 verses. He says, but as for you, speak the things which are proper for sound doctrine, that the older men be sober, reverent, temperate, sound in faith, in love, in patience. The older women likewise, that they be reverent in behavior. They're not slanderers. They're not given to much wine. Teachers of good things, that they admonish the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. Likewise, exhort the young men to be sober-minded, in all things showing yourself to be a pattern of good works and doctrine, showing integrity, reverence, incorruptibility, sound speech that cannot be condemned, that one who is an opponent may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say of you. Exhort your bondservants to be obedient to their own masters, to be well-pleasing in all things, not answering back, not pilfering, but showing all good fidelity, that they may adorn the doctrine of God our Savior in all things. Think about what that list just painted out. It shows us that the older men are to be showing the younger men how they ought to be living as good stewards in the community, as good husbands, as good fathers, and examples to the younger men who are behind them and the generations younger than them. And it paints the same thing for the women. How to be good wives, mothers, sisters. But above all, to be a good, sound Christian. To not go out here and to be, and he said, notice what he says in verse 7. All things showing yourself to be a pattern of good works, in doctrine showing integrity, reverence, incorruptibility, sound speech that cannot be condemned, that the one who is an opponent may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say of you. If you have to go up against someone and rebuke them for something, don't leave the door open that they come back and say, well, you've done this, 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 and this, and this, and you're still involved in it. Well, none of us are perfect. We all have our faults. But don't be out here committing these sins that leave you open. Live a Christian life. Look to those who are in authority above us. Don't use the internet and social media platforms and email and phone calls and everything else under the sun to blast your brothers and sisters in Christ out of the water, or anyone else for that matter, elected officials, whoever it is. You'd be surprised how many times, and you know, don't answer this out loud, please. Don't answer it out loud when I ask this question. Just answer it in your mind. How many times you click the TV on and you see somebody blasting somebody out of the water, and you come to find out they were a member of the church? Or you go on social media and you see that there are members of the Lord's church who are blasting our elected officials out of the water by calling them names, slandering them, and doing that which is not Christ-like. Or they're blasting a brother or sister in Christ out of the water. Or they're slandering against an eldership somewhere. Or their own family. Where did authority begin? Authority began in the Garden of Eden when God created man and woman. He instituted the sacred institution of marriage. God was in full control. Then we have the home. Then everything else branched out from there. It all comes back to the home. Wisdom and authority starts at home. And when I said that I have to remind myself on a daily basis about these things, I do. I want my daughter to realize that there is structure and that there's authority and there are consequences when you cross a line that you shouldn't cross. I'd much rather reach down and smack her on the backside or smack her hands while she's growing up, and she might have a little bit of a pouty fit and may not like me for a little bit, but that's fine. I'd much rather that than her grow up and go out here and commit some crime and either be killed or incarcerated because I failed to do my job. Or how about the elders in the Lord's church? When a member goes out here and does something that brings shame and reproach upon the body, and it's a member of the congregation where those men are elders and they're overseeing that congregation, those men go back and begin to evaluate themselves and say, where did we fail? What did we do wrong that we didn't feed, that we're not feeding them correctly? What can we do better to help correct this problem? Authority comes back to it. Wisdom regarding authority runs so much deeper than anyone ever thinks about. It comes all the way back to the home. And that's where it starts. The ultimate authority was God, established in the Garden of Eden with marriage, and we come out from there. Brother Roger Rush, and I've said this before, but he said it perfectly. I think it was the most perfect way of saying this. It's easier to get a marriage license than it is to get a driver's license. It takes more to get a driver's license in this country. You have to go and you have to be tested through the driving test. You have to take a written test. You have to go through all these skills tests. Yet you can get down to the local courthouse, walk in, you give them your name, your birth date, and some other information. You give them the little bit of money, whatever they want. They hand you a certificate and say, there, you can get married. Think about that. That's where authority begins. And we take it so flippantly in this country. We take it flippantly. We ought to be teaching your young people marriage is the most serious and the most sanctimonious relationship you can have outside of being a Christian. We've forgotten where the authority originated with God. And when we miss all the mark on all the other things that we've talked about this evening, we don't have the authority for the elders in the church. We don't have authority for our parents. We don't have authority for elected officials. We don't have authority for government or for law enforcement or any of these things. It shows there has been never any authority or any example shown to have authority, to have wisdom enough to know that we need to respect God. That's where we need to be back to. The whole thing in a nutshell comes back to this. It comes back to that. It's just the home. It comes back to we have to begin with ourselves. Mom and dad, husband and wife, treating each other the way they ought to. Marriage is getting along where they need to be. Marriage is being what God intended them to be. One man, one woman for life. Children being brought up that they respect mom and dad. But above all, they respect God. They're brought up to respect God, they're brought up to respect mom and dad and respect others. Then we see a turnaround. Sonia, I'm not going to pick on you, but I have a question. And Jana's sitting in here too. I'm going to ask you ladies a question. How long did it take for the pattern that you described a few minutes ago, Sonia? How long did it take for that pattern to develop in the public school system? Was it there when you all started teaching? No. It took a while to develop. It took a few years for it to present for this little dirty little problem to show itself. Forgot Troy's a school teacher, and we got others in here too. Didn't forget about you, I promise. But think about this. It didn't appear overnight, and it's not going to go away overnight. But it has to start somewhere. And that's where it has started with us. Don.
In Proverbs, well, there's a Ecclesiastes, there's a statement there that God created man to be upright, but man has many devices. And I think we see that played out. First of all, we see it in the history of the Jewish nation in the Bible, that they sought out so many ways to disrespect God. That was because of their going into captivity. Disrespect for God's authority. Because God said right at the beginning, you do what I say, and I'll be your God, and you'll be my people. If you don't do it, then, and he spelled out what the consequences were. And I think when we think about authority of God, God talked about some of the people that accomplished his will. I don't mean they were righteous, but he said, my servant Cyrus, or my servant Nebuchadnezzar. These were unrighteous people. They were rulers in the secular world. And yet, when we think about our day and time, what about the rulers in the secular world? We don't know. God is looking down. He sees the whole picture. We don't know what the ultimate outcome is of things that are going on. And that's why it behooves us to respect authority.
Exactly. We don't know what you hit the nail on the head there. We don't know what the ultimate outcome is. We don't know what God knows. We don't know we don't know the grand scheme of this entire picture, how it plays out. We don't really want to see that. You know, like you said, there were when God called Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus his servants. They were sinful men. But God utilized those individuals to teach the children of Israel a lesson. What happened in this thing, and I'll leave you with this. Think about this. The physical nation of Israel, why are they not in existence today? They didn't have the wisdom to adhere to God's will. They rejected his authority. They lost. People will say, God made a promise that there be a physical nation brought up. Yes, God made a promise. But who didn't adhere to their end of the bargain? Children of Israel. Think about this. That was a physical price to pay. That was a physical price to pay. But if we reject the authority of God now, what's the consequence? Spiritual. It's not instantaneous. It'll happen in the day of judgment. And I just realized I ran way over because here come the little guys. But the question is, where do we stand in our life with God? Are we exercising spiritual wisdom, submitting ourselves to the authority of God? Or are we still wandering around saying, God, I know better than you. I still have time to live. For those, and I'm not going to mention names, but Sunday this week, a member at Charlestown's daughter-in-law, 32 years old, suffered a seizure. And that young lady at 32 years of age passed from this life yesterday. 32 years old. 2 young children at home. Death knows no age. Doesn't matter if you're 32, doesn't matter if you're 2, or if you're 102. Your life can be taken in the blink of an eye. Roland, what song you have picked out? That's a good song. Because when we think about authority, we have to submit to God. What does he know? Christ is referred as what? In 2 Timothy and over in Revelation. He's referred to as Lord of Lords and King of Kings. And that's truly what he is. He's the authority of all authorities. And that's where we need to submit our will to. So anybody that's here this evening, whether you've been washed in the blood or you've yet to do that, if you need to make yourself right, I invite you to come